You're listening to the Myerson Line. Life cycles, bicycles, fast lines, and hot takes.
All right, at long last. I'm embarrassed about how long it's been, but our last guest was Phil Gaiman in November of 2016, and here we are in October of 2017. I apologize to the listeners for not having done a podcast in that time. I've certainly put some effort into it. I do have some guests lined up who are interested in talking, but with bike racing and a baby and a job and all of the other important things, it's just been impossible to line things up. But I am very happy to be talking today to Gerri Moriarty. Hi, Gerri.
Hi, Adam. It's nice to speak with you.
Yeah, it's been quite a while since we've spoken as well, maybe over a decade, in fact. And so why I have Gerri on the show, and we'll talk a little bit about her in a minute, but I have been, I would say, increasingly obsessed with a program that Gerri ran in the 2000s. I think is mainly when it was at its peak.
Yeah, it got started in the late 90s, but it carried into the 2000s.
Yeah. A program called Cycling Made Real that, Gerri and I were acquaintances, and we'll talk about that through bike racing. But in the past decade or 15 years of working on growing the sport and thinking about the sport's problems and sort of trying to pitch in my own way with the Victoria Series and having separate Cat 4 races for women and then eventually separate Cat 3 races for women and watching that grow, that paralleled what Cycling Made Real had done before me. And I watched Gerri, maybe not single-handedly, but sometimes it seemed single-handedly, and I'm sure it felt single-handed to her sometimes. She grew women's cycling first in New England and then eventually nationwide. And it was hugely successful, and we'll talk about this. And then it wasn't, and then it disappeared. And from my side, Gerri disappeared. I didn't know what had happened and why it had ended and what Gerri had moved on to. And so as I've been getting more involved again in trying to grow the sport and thinking about ways, not just to develop the sport, but to grow the sport in the first place, to recruit new people to bike racing, which is outside of my area of expertise, or in the past outside of my interest, I kept finding myself going back to the Cycling Made Real website, which is still up and is impeccably documented. Gerri recorded what she was doing and made it so that it was repeatable, franchisable even in other regions, and successfully did that. And I couldn't believe it when I found it and that it was still there. And I've wanted to reach out to Gerri for a while, and I finally, coming home from the USA Cycling Sport Committee meetings that we had earlier this week, and going on and on to people there, including USA Cycling, about Cycling Made Real, I realized I just need to get on the phone with you, Gerri, and hear the story and use the podcast as a way to teach all of the people who've come into the sport since you've left, who don't know you and have never heard of this program, what it is that you did and why it was successful, how you did it, and why it is defunct, how it ended and why it ended, and maybe get some advice from you and maybe some cautionary tales from you, some warnings from you, etc. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for joining us. Yeah,
I have to first say I'm just flattered that you remember all that, and I appreciate that it was noticed by you, and because it is old at this point. It was like I said, something I had got going in, I would say, the late 90s, and I definitely remember the details and the feeling and the just the motivation for creating the series. And it did seem to be the right formula at the right time. And it did branch out beyond New England fairly quickly. And you're right to notice that it was well documented. Again, I'm flattered that you noticed that, because I did take some effort to document what we did, to do exactly that, make it replicable to other parts of the country, and to try and make it a little easier for someone to just sort of pick it up and go with it locally. And that is what actually happened to a varying degree at some other regions in the country where there was a champion. And I guess that's what I became, was just a champion of this idea, not just a creator, but I had to like put in a lot of effort, and it did take a lot of people and some explaining and some organizing to make it lift off and to take off. But once it got going, it wasn't particularly difficult to keep people motivated to participate, because it just seemed to be the right set of incentives at the right time. We just sort of got lucky, I think, in some ways, putting it together. But being inside the need, feeling firsthand what was missing, I think I was just able to put together the right package of incentives and benefits to all the constituents, right? So there were different people had different needs. So promoters had one need, participants had another need, USA Cycling had a need. I had to kind of think in terms of marketing, right? What does everybody need? And so we put it together, and I can tell you the motivating event because I remember it clearly. That's a story that I could tell, and it would probably be a story that resonated with a lot of women at the time, and probably maybe even today. And just by background, I haven't been racing my bike in a long time, and we can pick this up later in our conversation, but I did drop out of cycling, so I've gotten busy being a mom, and my career has kept me busy. So I have not been able to race bikes in a number of years, so I'm not current on the scene and the numbers of women showing up at races, and you could fill me in better on that, Adam.
Yeah.
But maybe it's not so different as it felt for me back in what I will call the late 80s, when I first became introduced to bicycle racing, and I thought I would give it a go. I had never raced bicycles, but I saw other people doing it, and I became introduced to it in a way that I don't think was terribly different from a lot of my women friends. Was I had a boyfriend at the time who was racing bicycles, and went to one of his races and realized that there were women there, and that looked fun, and I could do it, and I became excited about buying a racing bicycle and just getting started training, and completely ignorant to what was involved. But I quickly found a very motivated circle of friends, mostly men, because it was a sport that was mostly men, and they were perfectly willing to help. So meeting some other women interested in cycling, you sort of formed your clique of people that you would train with. And so we maybe did some training races as complete amateurs with all the ignorance that went along with being a brand new bicycle racer. And I think we might have gone up to Loudon, New Hampshire. That series has been running for a long time, where they were doing Thursday night bicycle races. And we might have done a few of those when a girlfriend and I decided we would do our first real race. And we chose, foolishly, to go up to Vermont to do a race through Smuggler's Notch.
Yeah, the Stowe Road Race.
Yes, the Stowe Road Race. And it was a lot to do. I mean, we shouldn't have started with that one, I guess is my point.
Yeah, right.
It was challenging, long and hard and challenging. And being ignorant, we paid our registration money, and it was an open women's field. And I'll never forget that at that race was, here we were, ignorant Cat 4s, and we were right there on the starting line in this open field of women who were Pro 1, 2, 3, 4. That there was just one women's category, and we were all together. And I remember that Rebecca Twigg, whose name I knew, was on the starting line with us. And for people who don't remember Rebecca Twigg, she's probably my age. She had already won a silver medal at the 1984 road race in Los Angeles. And she was so this was probably, I'll guess this was probably like 1990 or 1991 maybe. And she was making a comeback and pursuing the Olympics again for Barcelona in 1992. And there she was on the starting line, this woman who had already won an Olympic medal. And there are my girlfriend and I, Cat 4 women, first race ever in our life. And it was just futile. I mean, it was just absurd that we would be in the same race with this level racer. And I just remember thinking, okay, this is nuts. I don't want her to be in my race, and I'm sure she didn't want me to be in her race. I mean,
I mean, it hasn't changed. Unfortunately, that hasn't changed. Your story will sound very, very familiar to any female bike racer listening. They all have had the same experience still today. So unfortunately.
There's an unfortunate element to that, but fortunately this will resonate. And so, so of course we start out in this big parking lot, and this road race essentially starts uphill, and we were doomed, and we were separated, and we were spread out. And I was even separated from my girlfriend, who I think was up the road ahead of me and was a better climber. And so she got through that notch ahead of me, and I was alone. And she ended up being alone, and we rode that course alone. And it was just basically a lovely ride through Vermont as opposed to a race for us. And after the race, we shared this experience with a lot of our men friends, some of them who were racing in their own very specific categories that day. And I just remember this feeling of never understanding what they were talking about riding in a pack. It just eluded me, right? I couldn't keep up. I couldn't keep up with the men. I couldn't keep up with the strong women. How would I ever learn to ride in a pack? Which sounded like fun and sounded like so much a part of the race, but how would I ever be in a pack? And that's really where my motivation came from, because I just thought this can't be right. This is absurd. This just cannot be right. So I went to the data. I guess I have to say that the first thing I did was I looked for data because it just didn't make sense. And the men's fields were bigger, and I could understand why each nuanced group could have their own category when that many men were showing up. So I remember one of the first things I did was I went to USA Cycling and asked if I could see the data. And I got that data. And I remember seeing it and realizing, there's the obvious problem. When you saw the data at the time of who was registered, and I think at the time I only asked for New England, perhaps. That was where my interest was. So I asked for the data of all the women who were registered in the 6 New England states, and it was the vast majority were, in fact, registered as beginners, as category 4 women. And it was probably like close to 80% of all the women who were racing bicycles at the time were registered with USAC as a Cat 4, as a beginner.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I realized, okay, so the market for bicycle racing is not the 1, 2, 3 women. There's so few. There were like literally, less than 100 probably at the time. No, I think there were like less than 50 women in all the 6 New England states who were a Cat 1, 2, or 3. So all the volume of participants were in the Cat 4s. So I realized right away, if I were a bike promoter, it only made sense to offer a Cat 4 only category. Mm-hmm. Because if you want women to show up, I remember thinking immediately, if I knew there was a race that was offering just a race for beginners, that one I would be absolutely sure to go to. And it became obvious quickly that was the solution, was to offer only if you could only afford as a promoter to offer one woman's category, then the one to offer was a Cat 4.
But you had to convince them of that at the time. They were not sold on that, if I recall. You had to sell them on that idea.
I did, but I have to say, I don't remember it feeling like a hard sell, because they were...
You had data.
I had data, and I could show the data, and the data made total sense. And it also was my observation that most of them were looking for a solution that would bring out more women. So when you show them the data and you shared that your goal was to bring more women in total, then the data kind of spoke for itself. And it did, as I recall, it wasn't particularly difficult to get some promoters to go out on a limb with me and just try it, even if they just tried it for 1 year, which by the time I got this going, I'm going to guess it was probably around 1995 or 1996, somewhere in that era. And that's where the series originated. And we got it going from looking at the data was really how it kicked off.
Yeah. Well, and so for people who want to take a look at this, the website is up. It's cyclingmadereal.wordpress.com. And if you Google Cycling Made Real, I think that's the quickest way to find it. And in particular, I think the interesting page there's a link. It's a very dated website, which is cute at this point. It shows you how long ago you were working on this, and it's a miracle that it's still there. But
I've not even seen it. I haven't even.
Oh yeah.
So now I'm a little worried about what you're going to see there.
No, well, it's a word. It doesn't look like a GeoCities site, but it does look like a WordPress site, so it's fine. And the links are in a sidebar. It's just web design has changed, and I like the fact that it's a bit frozen in time. But if you look in the links on the side, there's a link for the CMR model, and it's wonderful. Just the summary there, and so what you ended up creating was a regional point series for the Cat 4s, where you went to these organizers, as I recall, and said, hey, here's what we're trying to do. We want to give these Cat 4 women a reason to stay in the sport and give potential new racers a lower barrier to entry. If they don't have to line up against Rebecca Twigg, they are more likely to line up in the first place. But here's the important part. And so that's successful, and that is important. But here's where I thought you went further. There were post-race clinics. There were skills clinics. You had non-racing events where you brought all these women together. You created a community of Cat 4 women, and you didn't just say, here's a race you can do. I think this is also the area where the club system was starting to wither, where a lot of us joined cycling clubs, and we learned how to race bikes through our local cycling club, men and women both. And it was harder for women in that case because there weren't necessarily women-only clubs, and if you joined a club as a woman, you still were going on group rides with men who, I think, as you said, would often be encouraging and helpful, but certainly a group ride of experienced men, while you might learn something, you still had to be fit enough to keep up with that group ride to be able to learn anything. So when you describe your racing experience as more or less a solo time trial, I think it's what you said in there is very important, because what it describes is you were having a bike racing experience that was completely different than what a Cat 4 male, or any male racer in a big field was having. The men were racing. They were experiencing bike racing in a pack with pack dynamics and drafting. You were riding around alone with Rebecca Twigg 10 minutes up the road. Who would want to? That doesn't sound fun. That's not what bike racing is. And so why would you stick it out? Why would a Cat 4 racer say, this is fun, I want to keep doing this? You might as well, switch to triathlon or something at that point if you're going to do solo time trials. The beauty of bike racing is lost on you if your races consist of riding around by yourself. So,
yes, and I actually did think of switching to triathlons at that time.
Yeah, or mountain bike racing.
Yeah, or mountain bike racing. Yeah, those thoughts did cross my mind. And by the way, thank you for suggesting Rebecca Twigg was only 10 minutes up the road.
Right. She was probably 10 minutes ahead of second place.
Yes. So creating the series set of races was, you're right, and thank you for pointing that out, it was really only part of it. And I did want to make the group of races that we compiled into a series to be a compelling list that was cross-discipline. So I made sure to include road races and criteriums and a time trial, at least one time trial, and at least one stage race. And that was to make the series broad in skill set, right? So that if you really wanted to climb up in the point standings, you do better to be at least diving into all disciplines and showing up at races.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but you're right. We did try to start the season with a skills clinic, and I reached out to very talented pro women who were willing to bring up beginner racers and would teach these. And because I'll be honest, I really wanted it to be taught by women. There's just an intimidation factor. I mean, Dick Ring years ago would help us with clinics, and I was grateful for Dick. And he was just absolutely delightful teaching these clinics. But I can just remember Dick talking about, hammering in his cleats, and I mean, just like he talked about, like just so much old school stuff that I felt like Dick, as a man, grateful as I was that he was helping, wasn't completely relating to all the women's needs. And so once we switched to getting it taught by women, there certainly was I think a comfort level of women learning from other women. It just seemed to help.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these skills clinics were something we did at the beginning of the season, and then we tried to keep it going at set races throughout the year, especially the criteriums that kind of worked well. We would put a knowledgeable coaching level pro woman racer on the back of a motorcycle to follow the criterium and take notes and hold a post-race clinic. And the women seemed to love that because the immediate feedback of an observer there to teach a clinic afterwards and point out things that she observed during the race was, again, just a way to continue with the learning. And I also think one of the things that we did well, if anyone ever tried to repeat this effort, was just a real emphasis on communication and really being out there immediately with the results, communicating about clinics, communicating about things that might interest the women, and developing the email list. And social media was much more in its infancy at the time, but we made great use of email lists and trying to make sure that we could reach out to women who might not have their license yet, and maybe we could find women at triathlons who are interested in trying bike racing. So really communicating and over communicating, and not just communicating with participants, but really trying to communicate with sponsors and really communicating with race officials, get them to announce the series, race promoters. I tried to make sure that race promoters knew the results and were communicated our grateful attitude of having their race be part of the series. So the communication, I think, ended up being a real important part of what made the effort successful.
Yeah, and that aspect at least is easier to do now, and we have improved. I think many race organizers do a good job of that now because it is much easier to do when people expect it. Often you arrive home, by the time you get home from your race, the full results are already up online. That's how far we've come in that area. On the other hand, we are literally right back where we were, in my mind, when you started this program. And this is part of why I'm so interested in it now, is because you made so much progress, and I want to get back and talk about the progress and the growth that happened from there. But we need this program again now, because while we have made progress in some areas, and like I said, in the Vittoria series, which for you was the New England point series at the time, our cyclocross series, our New England cyclocross series, we do have separate Cat 4 and Cat 3 women's fields. And I created those fields again after your model, where the fields were filling, they were popular, but I knew we weren't going to get any more growth unless we created some capacity. And so I didn't quite have enough women to fill those fields, but by giving the Cat 4 women their own race, then we filled that Cat 4 women's field because they showed up for it. More women came out than had been coming out when they got their own field. And that allowed the Cat 3 women then to have their own field too. And the whole thing grew. And so in some areas, like cyclocross, we are still successful there. But in road, especially, these numbers have dropped off to the degree that, cycling's in decline. Membership is down everywhere. Right. People are doing other things. They're doing gravel races. They're doing fondos. They're simply riding with their friends on the weekend. but they aren't racing bikes. And there are certainly increased challenges for race promotion and race promoters. So costs have gone up, which means entry fees have gone up, but prize lists have generally gone down. And we're trying to decide, are prize lists important? Is that an incentive? We've done a increasingly good job of creating equal prize lists for women, which I think is symbolically important. But that doesn't necessarily get more women or even men out to race. How I've described it is equal prize lists don't get more women to show up, but unequal prize lists will definitely keep women at home. And so that is enough of, for me, it's a sense of fairness in the first place. That's the only motivation I personally need as a race organizer. But other organizers who are looking at their bottom line are saying, I'm not going to give the women equal prize money if only 10 of them show up. And while
right, it's an economic decision for a promoter, and you can't fault them for that.
I will. I don't mind. I'll I just take some money away from the men if you have to. So, we could have a separate conversation there, but we are at the point, at least with that, where pay the men less, stop thinking about entry. We're at the point where we shouldn't be thinking about prize lists as based on entry fee income. They don't have anything to do with each other. It's all a pot of money, and how you divide your race revenue up for your expenses is a matter of what you care about. So
and those prize lists are more important to the participants in the higher levels.
That's right.
Back in the Cat 4 Women's Series day, we'd always be grateful if there were any prize list, but I tried to de-emphasize that, because at the Cat 4 level, that's really not why you're there. And so we could get away with de-emphasizing money for prizes. But when there was money, my advice to the promoter was go as deep as possible. Make the top prize very modest so that there were some dollars that you could go as deep as possible with, because it was my observation that when women ended up in the money or in the prize list, there was just a sense of wonder that, they could not just make the podium, but make the prize list, right?
Yeah, be recognized for their 11th place.
Exactly. Yeah. Even if it was $5 or $2, it just. Yeah. So I always encourage a promoter, spread it like peanut butter thin, and go as deep as you can, because I can just remember the sense of pride that women would have for a modestly placed finish near the top that was at least in the money, even if the money was super low. It was symbolic.
Yeah. And so that recognition keeps them. That's what keeps people in the sport.
Yeah, and we did that with points in the series. We made sure to award points. So long as you finished, you would get points. Even if you were the last place finisher, as long as you got across the finish line, you got some points. And I almost did that as a last minute addition, not really giving it much thought. And it ended up being one of the most important things that we did for getting women to just don't drop out, just finish.
Yeah.
And there were so many instances of women that just knew they were just going to keep going, and they were going to finish that race, and they were glad they finished in the end, and they ended up doing it because they knew they would get some finishing points, and they would slowly climb up in their series standing. It was a tremendous motivator that I almost didn't do. And then once I did it, I made sure to never forget to go all the way. Everyone who finishes got points.
Yeah,
and it was
brilliant.
So it's related to the prize list, right? So if you're in the points or in the prize list, even if it's modest, there is a motivating effect there. And so at the series, because it was for beginners, having prize money was always nice, but we tried to de-emphasize that. And we certainly made a lot of hay with product prizes. Those were always welcome from sponsors, because that was a nice reward too, even if it was just a little product item. That helped a lot. And so we tried to de-emphasize the money. And we also made, in this particular series, part of our formula was there was no entry fee for being in the series. If you showed up at a series race, by definition, you ended up being in the series. Just the barrier of entry to participating in the series was very low. You really just needed to show up.
It's amazing. It's critical. And that's that sense of belonging and accomplishment and incentive by just recognizing you for showing up you're right. You might not have thought of it as crucial when you first came up with the idea, but I can see how it it kept people coming back and seeing your name on a list, like
Yeah,
even if you're the only one who notices, I think it has a psychological impact. And
I think so too.
yeah, and so it was hugely successful. And I'm not sure how many years it took for you to have more Cat 4s than you could handle, but I remember a turning point being where you had created all these Cat 3s. You not only had grown the Cat 4 fields, but they had then become successful and scored points and upgraded. And you had that, which that led to the next problem, which was now you had all these new Cat 3s who still had to race against Rebecca Twigg.
Yes.
And maybe at that point it was Jan Boland, who's now Jan Tanner, and might have been Jan Tanner then, but they still were racing against world champions.
Right.
When they would go from Cat 4s to racing world champions. And so there needed to be an intermediate step, and you had now shown that there were enough women for the race organizers to dedicate an hour of their criterium schedule to adding another category, and that was a separate Cat 3 race. And so I recall the Cat 3 series, the series being extended to having a Cat 3 classification. But I also remember this having an unintended negative impact, which is that some race organizers said, well, I can't run a race for Cat 1-2 women. And all of a sudden, some organizers would have a Cat 4 race and a Cat 3 race, which was great. But the 10 Cat 1-2 women who lived in New England, and that's about all there were at that point,
Right.
sometimes did not have races to do and were, I wouldn't say forced, but were often racing in the men's races in order to accommodate maybe the fact that the promoters thought that they could only run 2 women's fields, or even if they did run a third women's field, what's the point of running a field for 10, 1-2 women? That's not really a bike race either.
Right. Yes, it was a problem, and it was a good problem.
Yeah,
right.
right. It's a sign of your growth.
There was growth. Yeah. But yeah, there was a decision that the promoter would have to make, especially in a criterium where you can only close that road down for so many hours, and you have to have only so many fields that you can offer. So they had to make a hard decision because now all the numbers were in the Category 3 and Category 4 women's field, and so again, if you want to attract the most women, how would you do it? So one of the things that we tried to do to soften that blow, soften that difficulty, was to include in the series. I remember doing this to try and help soften this problem. Was we would put some 1, 2, 3 races as part of the series, but only count the 3 results. So you might finish 10th in that race, but you won the Cat 3s.
Yeah.
And so we tried to help the Cat 3 women with that experience as best we could. But it was from the outgrowth of, you're right, all these Cat 4 women now were finally able to upgrade and race in the next category, which meant they had to often bump up to the 1, 2, 3 effort. But I know there were a subset of people that were maybe a little frustrated by some reduced numbers of women's Pro 1-2 races in New England, but on balance, a lot more women were racing that weekend.
Yeah,
and hopefully
yeah.
that would have only been a temporary problem, as the idea would be we continue to funnel women up through the beginner ranks to fill out all of those categories.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think things are slightly different in cyclocross, but I think you can see that in, again, the Vittoria Series model, where we have 3 starts for women that are dedicated starts. There's an elite women's race, there's a Cat 3 women's race, there's a Cat 4 women's race. And we do run some subclasses within those starts, 40 plus women or junior women. We have a 9 to 14-year-old junior women's category, but we race them with the other 9 to 14-year-old boys, which isn't always perfect, but when you're talking about 14 and under kids, the gender differences aren't dramatic enough yet. They're racing against people that are at their same ability level. If you're a 14-year-old girl, you may not be as competitive as a 14-year-old boy in that field, and that's small compromise, because when they're all 9, they're all the same. They can compete with each
my
other.
daughter's 11,
Yeah.
and she's doing bicycle racing with the boys, and
Oh,
and
great.
she does cross-country running, and so she's largely doing it with. She's at that age that you're speaking of.
Well, so we've identified some of the success and how it grew, and you were able to expand it to other regions, primarily I think because you found other passionate, crazy people who were willing to do this work for free and cared enough about bike racing to, dedicate however many hours of their day. As passionate volunteers, we all know how much you can lose yourself in a project like this, and at the cost of other personal and work time. And so I'm not surprised at some point it ended for you. But so let's maybe, how did that happen? Let's talk about the decline. So, when did it reach its peak, and how did it fade? What happened?
Yeah, I think it probably was honestly a 10-year effort. I'm going to say roughly like 1995 to 2006-ish. And really, it was just admittedly on my part, family and career. I mean, work just got busier and busier. I ended up starting a family. I mean, it just took its toll to be able to continue to do this series and fit it all in, right? I mean, it's everybody's problem. It's fitting it all in. So I did try and put forth some effort to try and find someone that could just sort of pick it up and run with it. And there were some fits and starts of some very passionate women who gave it a go, and I tried to arm them with everything I could. We even had a terrific Microsoft Access database where we tracked all this stuff that was developed by one of the women in the series, who was a terrific programmer, Carol DeCourcy. She did a great job, and I would hand that over to the next person. But there was just, I feel some of it is my fault for not being able to find the next me that could just do it the way I did it. But everybody had their own approach to it, and differing degrees of what they were good at. And it waned for me out of necessity. I just was getting very busy with my career. My passion for cycling had not waned, but my ability to actually show up at races had waned. And a lot of it was just that. I mean, it was easy for me to grab results and talk it up and take care of the details because I was there anyway. And as I couldn't fit bicycle racing into my everyday life anymore, it just got harder for me to manage it. And I just never found maybe the perfect volunteer who would take it for years. We had volunteers who would give it a go for a season here and there, and that certainly helped for a little bit. But it's just like anything, it's emphasis and fitting it into everyday life. It did wane over time. And I guess part of why I documented everything was because I had always hoped that documentation would make it easy for someone to replicate it.
Absolutely. And of course, when you left and it died, I think it was largely forgotten. Some of these women are still around. Like when I look at your contacts for each region, certainly Catherine Snell is still around. She was one of your regional coordinators. She's still around. She's racing a bit. I was surprised in the Mid-Atlantic to see Erin Silliman on there. She's a new mom but is still racing, and her husband races, and they're involved in the scene in the Mid-Atlantic. She's certainly still there. Beth Fayant in Pennsylvania, certainly still involved in cycling. Dorothy Wong. Dot Wong runs everything in SoCal still, and she's running cyclocross races, and that's my relationship with her is related to running UCI cross races. Lee Hopkins is a mom and involved and is riding again and racing a bit again. And I think her kids are getting ready to start racing now. She ran your Southeast. She was your Southeast coordinator. So I see some of these people are still in the sport. And I can probably make a long list of women who are currently involved that I could cajole and guilt and prod into getting involved in a project like this again, because there is no shortage of passionate people right now who recognize that there's a problem and who want to chip in, but who, like you, they have lives and care about their own racing as well, and that's probably understandably their first priority. But with a little bit of leadership and organization, I think this kind of project could start again. I think the most important part is USA Cycling should have come in, identified your program, and bought it from you, funded it, implemented it nationwide, made it a USA Cycling program. They did not need, and they do not now need, to come up with any new ideas. You have done it. This is it. I have never seen a better model than this in my now 30 years in bike racing. This is it. You crack the code. And if you rely on enthusiastic volunteers for success, you will fail at some point. You will burn people out. There will be turnover. And the only way to make something like this successful permanently, I think, is with funding. And that funding either has to come from USA Cycling and our license fees. Now, I know USA Cycling can't afford that right now. With declining membership, how do you then spend more money on recruiting membership? You have less revenue at a time where you need to spend revenue to grow your sport again. It's really a tough spot for USA Cycling to be in. But a program like this right now, if they want to grow membership, if they want to sell more licenses, this is exactly the kind of program that retains members and generates new members, in addition to chasing Fondo riders and recreational riders, which is where they're losing riders to right now. Conversely,
Right.
or maybe the other model is, for me as a cycling coach who owns a coaching company, do I find a way to implement this in a for-profit model? Can I expand my business by selling this product to bicycle racers? That's something that I have to ask myself. Is there a way? Can I charge the women for these clinics? Can I pay the coaches for running them? Does it have a profit? Is there a profit model here? Because that would be another way to make it sustainable. If you were getting paid to do this, I'm sure it would never pay you what your actual career would pay you, but it might, if there was funding, that might pay someone enough for it to be worth it for them to do it if we were able to turn it into a job. That's a tough nut to crack as well.
Right. Yeah, but there's some possibility there. I will say, well, first of all, two things, like USA Cycling, getting back to that. I think even back in the day, there were people who suggested maybe USA Cycling should do more to support the program. And I was never worried or gave much thought to that, because I always felt like, well, we are the members of USA Cycling. Like, we are USA Cycling.
Yeah. I agree.
When we're doing this effort, this is USA Cycling. We are doing this for ourselves. So I never felt like we needed saving from USA Cycling. I always thought, this is grassroots, right? It's coming up from the bottom, and if they want to, from their perch, help replicate it, that's all. Well,
or fund it. The very least they could have done to help sustain it is, you either need, the thing that I've been talking about right now is, you either need staff hours. They need to provide you with, what if there was someone in Colorado whose job it was to do the work that you were doing? Then the program would still be here. So it needs a program coordinator.
Yeah, maybe a program coordinator is the way to look at it.
Or funding, or they give you a grant to help you run this, and it's enough to keep it going, something like that. But so either staff hours or funding, or both. Because it's programming, staff hours, and money. Those are the three things that I'm focused on right now, coming away from these sport commission meetings. And so you had programming, but you didn't have staff hours or funding.
Right. But we did also, and I want to get back to the thing you said about the profit. The clinics was the area that people would pay for that. So we did develop clinics that had a registration fee that people were very perfectly willing to pay for. And so those were self-funded, right? So we kept the registration fee low enough that we just paid all of our expenses, but we frankly probably could have charged more, because people were willing. They did fill up. People were willing to come. The content was good. I think the camaraderie was good. There were friendships made at these clinics, and they would tend to be weekend,
right.
Saturday, Sunday. I'm not talking about a week-long kind of thing. Just has to fit in people's life.
Right.
So that is an area that I think people are willing to pay for. People are willing to pay for coaching. People are willing to pay to learn.
Thank God. Thank God. Or
Yeah.
I'd be out of a job if they weren't. But no, I agree. And I think even though I don't want to be mercenary necessarily about it, when I'm thinking about sustainability, I do own a coaching company, right? I have, there's 10 of us working at this company, and we have mortgages and such. And so we do need to think about ways that we make a living as coaches in addition to, working with our regular clients. And so it would be silly, I suppose, to look at something like this and try to think about ways that it can be re-implemented and made sustainable and not consider a profit model. Is there a way to make this someone's business as a way to make it sustainable? And I think, of course, you can do that without it being exploitative or, if it's not a good product, people aren't going to pay for it. But you're right that they're willing to pay for coaching, and they're definitely willing to pay for good coaching. We've seen that with the camps and clinics that we run already for cyclocross. And I just think this model can be applied. If you were doing this for road, I think that's the best place to start with it. I want to grow the membership of USA Cycling for sure. But I could see doing this for cyclocross as well. Because I think in cyclocross especially, skills clinics become even more important, and cross races, like the same way you said, the criteriums are great places to learn. They're great places. Right. You run a clinic after Wells Ave every Sunday, and I think you'd get a good turnout for that. But got to find some way. Again, it's recruitment. I've never considered. I've always been interested in development. I have not thought very hard about recruitment. And so when you talked about the way you got started in the sport, you're right. It's a very typical story. I came to a bike race with my boyfriend and discovered cycling, or, people saw a local group ride and joined it, or they went into a bike shop and started riding with other people. And for me, it was, riding around on my bicycle by myself, just as a way to get off the street and look around the neighborhood, and then meeting the guys at the bike shop and them taking me out on a group ride. So I found out about cycling essentially on my own, but then that interest was nurtured through, the guys at the shop. And we know still to this day, bike shops are not often friendly places for women. They're places that women go and complain about the way they're treated by primarily male employees in bike shops. And we've identified that problem. I think a lot of shops are fixing it. There are more and more women working in shops, and they're trying to change the shop atmosphere. This is definitely something that we talk about a lot. But, where do people touch bike racing? Where do they encounter it? Maybe that, I watched Ram on TV. I saw Jonathan Boyer sitting up, eating a plate of pasta, riding no-handed, eating pasta off a plate in Ram on like NBC Sports. And that got my attention. I was like, oh, bike racing. So I think there's more televised bike racing now. And so there's more awareness of cycling in general. And I think the bike industry is trying to pay attention to women, but I still don't know how does one become a bike racer? That's the initial barrier to entry for bike racing is, where does it exist? How do you find it? Well, you don't join your high school team so I've been trying to dwell on that. How do I reach out? How do I reach across to the person who is not a bike racer yet and pull them across?
Right. Where are they? And where are they coming? These are the same things we asked ourselves back in the day. Are they coming from running? Are they coming from triathlons? And today, now that I have an 11-year-old daughter, she's into bike racing. I can't imagine how different my life would have been if I had been introduced to bike racing at age 11. Right. I was probably 30 by the time I had started seriously bike racing. And I just think a lot of you got to take a long-term view, but children are a source of future bike racers. And I was so pleased to see the high school mountain bike race scene that's developed.
NICA, we talk about it constantly. NICA is the thing that we all look at and go, why wasn't USA Cycling able to do this? Why didn't we do that? So I think USA Cycling is doing a good job of reaching out to NICA, and there are good relationships there right now. And I think NICA is a big example of future growth in the sport for sure. And so we need NICA for road racing, and we need NICA for cyclocross. And but you're absolutely right. NICA's doing something right, and it happened outside of USA Cycling, which I think makes it a failure on their part. But they're fixing it. They're working on it. We've got to turn those NICA kids into year-round bike racers who, take out USA Cycling licenses and race in the summertime outside of high school. But that is a great model to look at. I have a question for you regarding your daughter. So how did she find out about bike racing? I assume through you. Does that mean, are you riding still now? Did she learn about bike racing from you? How did it happen?
Yes, both. Yes to both. So we are a cycling family. We still have a basement full of every kind of bicycle, but we really appreciate bicycles in a different way, right? We have the rail trails and a small child, and she's getting bigger now. So we did a lot of biking with the trailer and towing her behind, and bikes are always a part of our vacations. And so we've never separated ourselves from the cycling scene, but we have, both of us, Mike and myself, really aren't so much into racing anymore. And I'm really enjoying bicycling in a different way. And one of our great rewards is introducing our daughter to bike racing. And she's just loving it. She's competitive. And yes, we're the ones that showed her what bike racing was. And we started, I think one of her first ones was, I think Cycle Loft sponsors a little kids race in, I guess, is it Burlington or Lexington?
Yeah, probably in Burlington. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this simple little loop around a grass field, and she just loved it. And now she's doing the mountain bike racing, and it's just great to see. It's great to see her. She's very sporty to begin with.
Yeah, that's great.
But my career has been defined by bicycles. The truth is, I got the job that I had because of, during the interview, I went to work for Segway, which is not a athletic device, but it's a electric transportation device. But I got that job because of my background in cycling. It was strange, but during the interview so many years ago, they wanted to know all about these cycling clinics and the cycling that I did, because they saw a correlation with cycling that I didn't appreciate right away, but I was hired on by them to teach people how to ride a Segway personal transporter. And since then, I've become very passionate about electric bikes. And so my career has sort of taken me into electric transportation, but not far from cycling. And
right.
I guess I'm destined to always work with things that have two wheels. I like it. I like electric bikes. I like cycling on my vacations. I like seeing my daughter be introduced to cycling. And I won't say that I'll never race again, because I have thought about it. I have thought, I should do it. I should get back into the Masters races. And some of my fondest memories were going over to Austria and racing in the Masters Worlds years ago. And I thought, I got to do that again. It's like, so I don't feel like I've quit bike racing forever. I feel like I'll dabble in it again. But yes to those questions. We really did become the source of my daughter's introduction to cycling. And so we have sort of stayed in it.
Yeah.
But our passions for cycling are just different. I mean, I still love going to Interbike, but I tend to go there for work anymore.
Right. Well, and it's funny because I think, I just retired from professional racing 2 years ago. 2015 was my last year. And so, now that I'm trying to figure out how much riding can I do to stay happy and sane, and how much racing do I need to do to stay satisfied. But with a 2-year-old, I love bringing him to the races. I always miss him when I'm there without him, and it's a good place for him to have some open space and run around on his balance bike. We live in a city. If we ride his bike here, we have to do it on the sidewalk, and sidewalk's not far from the street. Makes me very, very nervous, obviously. And the better he gets at it, the more worried about it I am. So, going to bike races as a family is a thing that I'm probably more excited about than my wife is, but I am looking forward to that. And so I love hearing your story about, I'm not going to push my kid to race bikes, but I think when you're exposed to it, it sells itself. He's gonna He's going to like it or not like it, but he's going to like it or not like it because of what it has to offer him, and how many years he's spent sort of watching me do it and becoming. He's growing up in a community, and that community is cycling. And your daughter, sounds like your daughter's having the same experience. Where, I mean, I pick him up at daycare on the, I have a racing bike with a baby seat on it, and I pick him up at daycare and we ride through the city, and he loves it. And so cycling, cycling is a part of my life, as you describe, in ways outside of racing. That's a bit new for me, but that's also, post-professional bike racing career, that's where you go with it if you're really a lifer. So I'm glad to hear that you're still a cyclist, essentially.
Yeah, I still consider myself one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think.
And I feel your anxiety about your son. The older they get, and the more competent they get at riding a bike and making those independent decisions. Like I know the feeling of feeling fine when she was attached to my bike on the third wheel, or the bike trailer, or just attached to my bike. But then when she was independently riding a bicycle by herself and having to make decisions about traffic, it's a little nerve-wracking. I sympathize with where that would go for you.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
she does now ride her bike to and from school, but we're fortunate to live in a fairly rural area in New Hampshire. I mean, I still hold my breath a little bit, but she is riding her bike to and from school, and that's an experience that it just seems fewer kids have
Very
these
few.
days.
Yeah, very, very rare. And even if you live close enough to walk or ride to school, parents aren't letting their kids do it because so many other people are being driven to school, and there's traffic that's caused by that backup. And I shouldn't be a hypocrite. I'm driving my son to daycare most mornings, and I go into downtown to do that opposite the commute and drive back out. But I do pick him up by bike when I can, and if my wife picks him up in the afternoon, she's taking the subway, she's using public transportation to do it. But I am using a car to take my son to daycare every day, and I don't love that. I don't want to be part of that system if I can avoid it, but right now it's the most efficient way for us as a family to get my wife to work and my son to daycare and me back to my desk in the least amount of time possible.
Yes,
City life.
So many of our experiences are similar and resonate. And I have to say, because now I'm more into just career-wise electric transportation, that having an electric bike has really opened up my mind to just possibilities of riding that I might have just otherwise taken the car, right? So just yesterday I had to run over to the soccer field to bring my daughter some snacks. And because I had an electric bike, I felt like I could get there before sundown.
Yeah. It's very
I felt
interesting.
like I could rush over there. I could do those few miles, get a little bit of exercise, and rush back before I got caught in the darkness. And my electric bike let me do that. And there's a hill between here and school, and when I had to pick her up and I had to climb back up that hill, I just find myself more willing to jump on the bike, knowing there's just instances where having a motor makes me jump on the bike more readily, and it saves me from taking the car. That's the point. I don't even use the motor because I really prefer to get my exercise. But there's times where having it is the perfect solution.
Yeah, where it switches from. It's not digital in terms of is it transportation, is it exercise? It's always some degree of both. It's always analog, and where you move the slider depends on your circumstances, right? So
right, exactly. So I think that's opening up cycling to a lot more people, and maybe there's people that become introduced to cycling because there's a motor, and I just electric transportation is just going to be more and more a part of all of our lives as time goes on.
Right. Well, and they've restarted the racing at Loudon on Thursday nights. I don't know if you have found out about this, but they've got the track back. And so just for your sake, if your daughter wants to get some criterium style racing in, or maybe you do as well.
You're planting a seed. Planting a seed, Adam.
That opportunity is there for you. Yeah, those races are back. So
yes, that's good to know.
So that's a good summary of how it started, where it peaked, why it's faded. But I think also for me, how relevant it still is, how useful this information is, how we're fighting the same battle right now. We're faced with so many of the same problems. I know these problems are cyclical. you like to think we'll get on the other side of them and we're always making progress. And we have made progress in many ways, but we're still facing issues of declining membership. And so as the membership declines, the incentive for organizers to host fields declines, and it becomes a vicious cycle, a descending cycle, where there are fewer riders and fewer races, and there's fewer racers because there's fewer races. And then all of a sudden, what do we got? We're back to where we were in the 80s. And that negative experience you had of riding around alone at the Stowe Road Race. That experience resonates, and I think will resonate for so many people. This was so helpful for me personally, because I want to solve these problems, and I'm really just thinking hard right now about what direction to take and how to do it. And I think the blueprint is here. I think your hard work has created programming that can still be implemented. And filling in the blanks for me and hearing the story from you is not only going to be helpful for me, but I think it's going to be incredibly helpful for everyone who listens. I think there are lots of people who want this info and who are going to be excited to hear the story. And I apologize if a bunch of people start reaching out to you again.
That's all right. That's welcome.
Yeah,
that's okay.
Good. Yeah, good. I'm happy you're willing to be available. If anyone wants to get you, your contact is, or at least your phone number is still on the website, but maybe I'll let people know if they want to reach you, they can maybe contact me and I'll connect you so you don't get totally bombarded.
Thank you. That's not a problem. I don't mind being contacted.
Okay. Do you want to give
all in the name of doing things for the sport?
Do you want to let people know where they can reach you?
Yeah, I guess the easiest way is I'll just give my email, right? That's probably the easiest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gerri.Moriarty@gmail.com.
And that is GerriMoriarty.
Yes, thanks.
I did that off the top of my head.
Oh,
I wasn't even looking.
Yeah, and Adam, I want to say thank you for all you do for the sport. I mean, you've put in a lot of effort and have, really become someone who I think deserves a lot of the credit for the success of cyclocross in New England, well, among other things. But, your tireless efforts have shown great dividends for New England. So you're to be congratulated.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I much as you probably did, it's a bit of a compulsion. I'm not sure it's always a good idea. I'm sure there are other things that I could be and maybe should be doing with my time, but you just, I'm not doing it out of the goodness of my heart. I think I'm doing it out of some compulsion that I can't control. Sometimes I wish I could. Yeah. We have to finish with our traditional question for all guests, you included. Even though this was a more serious episode than other episodes, we still need to know what your favorite Prince song is.
Well, so since we've been talking about the 80s and 90s, I guess I have to go with When Doves Cry. Is that one other people have chosen?
I don't think so, but it's a good one. I think I always want to encourage the guests, don't be shy about choosing a hit as your favorite song. You don't have to pick, an obscure B-side and impress everybody. I think When Doves Cry is a great choice. That was a song that moved a lot of people. In my description of myself on Twitter, part of how I describe myself is too bold and never satisfied. So there you go, right from When Doves Cry. So I like your choice. Yeah. Well, thank you, Gerri. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It's been really a pleasant experience to think about some of this stuff again. And I want to thank you for taking us down this path.
Yeah, it was great to catch up. I appreciate the personal side of it as well. We haven't seen each other in a long time, so that's a fun part of the podcast as well.
Yes, for me as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Adam.